Oxiatol the Silence and Taurox the Fury are about to arrive in Total War Warhammer 2, along with a whole bunch of new units for both the Beastmen and Lizardmen. We're going to take a close-up look at all of these units, talk about their stats and their abilities, so you can be prepared and know what all the units are for when this DLC is released. So, let us begin. Oh scheisse, it's the Beastmen first of all, with the big man Taurox the Brass Bull. He is an absolute melee powerhouse with great defensive stats, 130 armor, reasonable melee defense, great offensive stats, loads of melee attack, weapon strength, charge bonus, armor piercing as well, and fire damage. So as you might be able to guess just by looking at him, he is a damage dealer all about murdering everything, but he is still pretty tough. For his abilities, he has Brass Body, obviously, which will give him a 40% damage resistance and 24 melee defense, which will recharge once he's been in melee for a while. So that will serve to make him more tanky, making use of his Brass Gift. He also has Blood Beast, which is an explosion that does fire damage and applies the burnt -8 leadership penalty. That's going to be good for getting him out of trouble when he's surrounded. He also has a couple of existing Beastmen abilities, Slaughterer's Call, which increases melee attack, leadership and charge bonus to himself and nearby allies, and Blood Greed, which pretty much does the same thing when he's engaged in melee, but only for himself. And if that wasn't enough damage output, he also has an item, Rune Tortured Axes, which is a constant buff to himself when he's engaged in melee, which increases his melee attack, armor piercing damage, and base weapon damage. So overall, he's just an absolute damage powerhouse, as you might expect, but still very tough. And naturally with that comes a hefty price tag. Next, another Lord option, the Doomball. This is just kind of budget Taurox, to be honest, very similar, still very tough, lots of damage output, big armor piercing, weapon strength. He does have a new effect on his melee attack, Dazed, which reduces the target's melee defense by 10 and speed by 25%. So that's going to be pretty powerful, taking away a fair chunk of the enemy's melee defense and slowing them down so they can't escape as well. For his abilities, he's got Slaughterer's Call and Blood Greed, just like Taurox. He's also got Deadly Onslaught, a pretty common ability. But he also has some unique abilities in Barbed Knuckle Boxing. This is a buff for himself, increases melee attack and both kinds of weapon damage, so just a big damage boost. He has the Hellfire Sword item, which can imbue him with fire damage and increase both kinds of weapon damage. And also the Potion of Full Hardiness to increase his charge bonus and make him unbreakable. So very similar to Taurox, lots of damage output, just a little bit cheaper. Next, the Great Brayshaymin. This is actually the free LC and isn't really part of the DLC, but I thought I'd include it here anyway. This is another new Lord option. You've got 4 of them with a different lore of magic, Shadows, Death, Wild, and Beasts. This is just a Beastmen's option for generic caster Lords that are rubbish in melee, but of course come with the magic. They can have the new Tuskor Chariot or the Razorgore Chariot mounts. These are going to be a great option for the Beastmen when you want to save money on the Lord. You can now combine your Lord and Caster in one. This price shown is of course them with all their spells, so naturally you'll probably want to take 3 or 4 spells off, so they will be considerably cheaper. They do have a Hex ability which will reduce nearby enemy melee attack, charge bonus and speed, and for their items they can have the Forbidden Rod and the Scroll of Shielding. Now for a new hero option in the Gore, a new melee specialist hero who seems to be a bit more geared towards fighting in the crowds, just because he doesn't have the armor piercing for fighting other characters perhaps, although obviously the more squishier ones will do fine. Got reasonable damage output, 400 weapon damage, nice charge bonus, decent melee attack, so he is going to be able to put out a good bit of damage. Got a nice silver shield as well, so he can protect himself a little bit. Although it does seem like he doesn't have enough melee defense for having a silver shield, only 40. Normally you'd expect maybe 45, 50 having a silver shield, but maybe that'll change. For his abilities, he does have Deadly Onslaught and Primal Fury, and also Will of the Dark Gods, which gives +4 leadership and +5 melee defense to himself and nearby allies. So a useful one to bring if you want him to fight alongside your frontline perhaps. And for his items, he has Sword of Anti-Heroes, an existing item that buffs damage, and the Potion of Speed. So a nice little cheap melee hero overall, less than 900 is a bargain I think, and he can have the Tuskor or Razorgore Chariot mounts. And speaking of Tuskor Chariots, there is a unit version which comes with 3 of them in the unit. They are quite simply a budget version of the Razorgore Chariot. Their stats aren't quite as good, but still decent. So they're just a cheaper option that you could maybe bring a few of if you want to go full on Bronze Age. Where they are a little bit more unique though is that they do have Vanguard deployment, which the Razor Gore chariot doesn't have. So if you want to bring a Vanguard build and deploy right up in your enemy's face, these chariots can go with you and be up there right from the start. Or you could sneakily deploy them behind the enemy, so some fun to be had with Vanguard deployed chariots. And to our first regiment of renown, Grog hooves of Wolf's Run. These are centaurs with throwing axes that have poison on both of their kinds of attack, still got the armor-piercing missiles, and they have an ability called Drunken Bravado, which gives them regeneration, perfect vigor, and +4 leadership, unless they are routing. So that's a really nice strong ability, gives them that regeneration, still got the centaur perfect vigor. So this is going to be a really great harassing unit. They're going to be hard to kill because of the regeneration and hard to catch because of the poison. A nice addition to the Beastmen roster. And to the big boy that people have been wanting for a long time, the Gorgon. A single entity monster that doesn't have the best defenses with only 50 armor and 34 melee defense, but of course does a lot of damage. Melee attack huge, weapon strength huge, armor piercing and anti-large. So they now have an anti-large monster, which is nice, and a beefy charge bonus as well. Now, despite his potential squishiness though, he does have Strength from Flesh, an ability that gives him 8 HP per second regeneration. So that's going to make him a little bit harder to kill, although it's only active when he's in melee. And then he also has Blood Greed and the other obvious traits you might expect, like Terror, for example. So a big, expensive, anti-large monster for the Beastmen. Something they've been missing, single entity units they didn't really have any of, apart from their Lords and Heroes, although if you count the Giant and Cygor, but those are really slow, so they're not quite the same. This is a nice addition to bring them up to speed with what all the other factions have. And then there is a Regiment of Renown version, the Brood Brute Behemoth. He has some stat improvements, but most notably has Frenzy and Scaling Damage, which means he'll do more damage to his targets the more health they've lost. So basically the same as the regular Gorgon, just a bit more damagey. Another new big boy for the Beastmen roster, the Jabba Slife. This pretty boy's stats are a little bit all over the place. He's got more melee attack than melee defense, which is usually the trait of a defensive unit, but he's also got pretty good weapon strength, which is armor piercing and anti-infantry, got a bit of a charge bonus, got poison and magical attacks, so he's just all round a bit mental, as you would expect by looking at him. However, the big USP of this big boy is his Aura of Madness, which is a constant damage effect to nearby enemy combatants, so a Mortis Engine effect essentially. He will hurt nearby enemies simply by being in melee combat, whether they're fighting him or not. He also has another ability called Spurting Bile Blood, which is a small vortex which will damage enemies every 15 seconds and also apply poison. So he's just doing damage all over the place in all kinds of ways. He's got Fear and Terror as well, so just overall being a massive damage dealer in all kinds of ways. Going to be good at fighting blobs so he can make use of his Mortis Engine effect, or just fighting alongside the front line. And if he wasn't mad enough for you, then how about Vorbagland's Broodmother, the Regiment of Renown Jabbaslythes. Very much the same, some improvements in stats, but armor sundering instead of poison this time, on her melee attacks and on her Scarring Bile Blood ability. The same as the poison one, but just does the armor sundering instead. Every 15 seconds she'll spurt out some bile, and that will sunder armor. And she still has the Mortis Engine effect, Aura of Madness. So that armor sundering, this might be a good one to bring if you're facing a heavily armored faction, the Dwarves, the Chaos. This is where this chunky lady can shine. So that is all of the new Beastmen units. Some really nice additions for them, bringing them up to speed a little bit. They got a lot of Lord choices now. They got some extra units to add into any Vanguard deployment builds. Those raw throwing axe centaurs and the Tuskor Chariots. And then you've got the single entity monsters, which are a big thing for Beastmen. They didn't really have any fast single entity monsters like a lot of other factions had. So now they've caught up with that, and they've got the Jabbaslythes as well, which is going to be good at fighting in those crowds a little more. So they've got some nice options to play with. Looking forward to trying out these new Beastmen in multiplayer. Now then, to the lizards. First up is of course the little fella Oxiatol. Now stats wise in melee, he's not up to too much. He doesn't have terrible stats, good melee attack and decent weapon strength, although not armor piercing and poison on those attacks, but he doesn't have much armor or health. So he's really not built to take any kind of pounding. Where he of course is going to shine is by being invisible and using his ranged attack, which is incredibly strong armor piercing, poison and magical attacks on that, as well as pretty decent range for a skink. So he is a ranged hero, he has Stalk and Vanguard deployment, so he's going to be invisible most of the time, but he has one very special ability that really makes him shine. Master Predator. This will give him plus 20 range, make him unspottable and give him snipe, but it will slow him down and he won't be able to move as fast. The big thing about this ability though is that you can turn it on and off when you want. It's activatable and deactivatable whenever you like with no cooldown. So very much the Deathmaster Snitch of the Lizardmen, but with a ranged attack instead of melee. He also has scaling damage like Deathmaster Snitch, so the more dead things are, the more damage you'll do. Gonna be great at sniping down characters and large things with that powerful ranged attack. Next to a new hero in the Skink Oracle, who comes mounted on a Troglodon whether you like it or not. So he cannot be taken off this mount, he is on this for life. And his melee stats are pretty much that of the feral Troglodon, which we'll look at later. Not too bad in the melee with decent weapon strength, which is armor piercing. Not bad melee attack, but nothing too special. Decent melee defense though. Not a lot of leadership, however. But the Troglodon does come with a strong missile attack, which is armor piercing, poison, and anti-large, which has pretty decent range as well at 120. So he can do alright using the Troglodon as a crowd fighter, taking out infantry and stuff, or sitting back and using that anti-large missile attack to blast down single large entities or monstrous infantry, lords and heroes. So a pretty versatile monster all around. And the Skink Oracle is a caster who comes with his own mixed lore book, which has Earthblood, Flock of Doom, Wisson's Wild Form, Fireball, Wind Blast and Harmonic Convergence. So a really nice selection of spells to choose from. He also causes fear and terror with the Troglodon, obviously. And one big bonus he does have over the feral Troglodon is that because the other one is feral, it goes into rampage sometimes. Whereas this one doesn't have that problem, as he is tamed, I guess. All this doesn't come cheap, but you can obviously drop off spells. Now to a new infantry in Chameleon Stalkers. These are a melee infantry with poison attacks. Melee stats aren't particularly fantastic, but they do have a missile attack which is pretty strong, does fire damage, although they don't have much ammunition. They're kind of designed as a shock infantry, much like maybe a peltast. You throw some javelins before and then you get into melee. That's what these kind of do. They rush up to the enemy, do their ranged attack, which is somewhat explosive by the way, and then get stuck into melee. But the good thing about these is that they do have 360 firing, so you can use a ranged attack, get into melee, get out of melee, and on your way out of melee, they'll use more of their ranged attack if you have ammo left. So a fun little skirmisher, going to be able to put the damage on any light infantry, whatever that be. A nice addition for all you skink army builders. Next, a regiment of renown Connoisseurs Terror, Terror, which apparently, yes, is a Jeff Goldblum reference because, you know, Jurassic Park. This is your regular old Connoisseur with improved stats, except it has Vanguard deployment, Strider, and doesn't go into Rampage. So, going to have the same role as the regular Connoisseur, but it's just going to be a bit more effective as it won't go into Rampage and will be somewhat better at the job. And of course, you can have some Vanguard deployed sneaky T-Rex fun if you really want to shit people up. And to one of the new monster options that we've seen slightly already, the feral Troglodon. Like I mentioned, the stats are pretty much the same as the Skink Oracle. It has a little bit less leadership, which gives it only 60, which isn't much, and it also is prone to that rampage. Still has the strong missile attack and the strong melee skills. So like I say, going to be good for maybe sitting out the way, trying to use up its ammo, sniping things down, and then when it's ready, get stuck into melee. Because it doesn't have great melee attack though, I mean it's not bad, but it's not fantastic for what it does, so it really wants to charge around a lot, because it does have a good charge bonus at 50, and it has terror which benefits from being charged around. So, pretty versatile dino for a blind boy. Maybe the days of double Bastillodon are gone, and it's now time for double Troglodon. We'll see. But hold up, there is the Pale Death, the Regiment of Renown version, which has some improved stats, better in the melee, slightly stronger ranged attack as well, and has an ability called Primeval Roar, which is an AoE buff to himself and nearby friendly troops, which gives 24 melee attack. So a good one to team up with the frontline perhaps, or maybe with a group of cavalry, charge him around with those. Still for the most part though, going to have a similar role to the regular Troglodon. And if blind dinosaurs weren't enough for you, how about some flying pigeon snakes? The Coatl or Coatl or Ghorgons, however you say it, I don't know, but it's a flying single entity unit for the Lizardmen. It has some decent melee stats, magical attacks, armor piercing damage, but its abilities is really where it shines. It has lesser Chain Lightning, which is just a smaller version of Chain Lightning, Uranan's Thunderbolt, which is just a normal spell, and a pretty cheeky ability called Master of the Sacred Places, which will give Stalk to everything in a 40-meter range of the Coatl itself, as long as it's not flying. So you could position some Saurus warriors and a Carnosaur underneath it, and they will be invisible and will have Stalk until you get close. So that could allow for some pretty cheeky plays. You can sneak a bunch of units up, the enemy might not realize that they're hidden under this thing, and well, that is just a recipe for a Dreadsaurian surprise if ever I've heard one. So a pretty unique unit with some nice offerings, a bit of damage output from itself, a bit of support in other ways, also has terror as well, so it can fly around, try and use that as much as possible. A nice addition to the Lizardmen flying roster. And there is a Regiment of Renown version, the Spirit of Tipok. It is incredibly colourful, has some improved stats, some better damage output potential, but slightly different in the abilities. It has lesser Banishment, which is just a smaller version of Banishment, which is kind of really just the same as Chain Lightning. It's just a vortex that moves around, so kind of similar really, not that much different. Also has Shield of Thorns, an AoE that buffs physical resistance and base weapon damage for itself and nearby troops, and still has Master of the Sacred Places like the normal version. So not too much different with this one really, perhaps a little bit more on the support side with Shield of Thorns, but for the most part, the same deal. So there we go, all of the new units in the Silence and the Fury DLC. Some nice additions for the Beastmen, really bringing them up to speed, and some nice new toys for the Lizardmen, nothing they really desperately needed, but some fun additions to play with. What do you reckon? Anything you like the look of, anything you don't like the look of? Let me know. I hope you've enjoyed this, thanks for watching, I'll see you in the future.